So when you look at how knowledge management can help people learn, and it is providing different venues for that learning, whether it is the training where you have people that are listening to fundamentals and building understanding, common definitions, or whether you are on the job and you're needing some type of a system or a process to push knowledge to you, or that you can pull from it readily to react or to make a difference in something that you're doing. IBM is using a lot of the social media tools to really make in what they're calling informal learning, but it's really learning on the job and using those tools to help push information out to them. So we're seeing a very strong relationship between the two, and you've got to define the audiences because it's not one size fits all.
Mr. Moore?
Well, from a user perspective, I can tell you absolutely there is a relationship, at least the way we conceive and utilize what we call KM. But when I mentioned earlier that we set up that office 4 years ago, their job one was to build something we call the Sustainment Knowledge Network, which is sort of a social network that used in a professional way. But this knowledge network the goal was to link that 450,000 person audience that I mentioned earlier, and basically try to link those who need some knowledge with those who have some knowledge, and it's kind of the right knowledge at the right point in time, getting back to the learning at the point of need, or the teachable moment, as Ms. Hubert mentioned, and it's working pretty well. I mean, we have about 140,000 active users on the network, and every day I see. I follow some of the communities of practice within the network, and every day I see knowledge sharing going on. You know, the digital natives, I guess is what we call them today, they love to share knowledge. I mean, you see it on Facebook. I learned more about my daughter on Facebook than I'd ever learned talking to her at the dining room table, I can tell you that. But they share knowledge with such ease. The knowledge is power thing. Knowledge is power, and they view it as sharing that knowledge, where some of us older digital immigrants and analog natives used to view knowledge as, you know, the more you had, the less you shared, the better off you were, and that's obviously not the way it is anymore. But back to that knowledge network, I'll use one quick example. In following some of the blogging, there was an 11 Bravo as an infantry soldier, and this was probably an E4 that was in an infantry company. And he had just been tabbed by the first sergeant to be the supply sergeant for the company. And he couldn't spell supply, so he gets on our Sustainment Knowledge Network and he says, "Hey, can anybody help me?" And literally within about 10 minutes, he had a Chief Warrant Officer 5 from the Quartermaster School giving him a tactical SOP, or standard operating procedure, for an infantry company on how to be a supply sergeant. And for an E4 to even talk to a CW5 in the ranks of the Army is pretty amazing in itself. That's sort of like talking to a general officer. And to get that kind of knowledge from that CW5 and then be given the offer, "Hey, if you have any other questions, just give me a yell." I mean, that's just amazing knowledge transfer right there. And that's real knowledge transfer right at the point of need for that young soldier. And that's powerful stuff. Then when I look at it from a more strategic perspective, you know, as senior leaders, we make decisions every day, and we manage knowledge to make those decisions. And sometimes I make decisions with what I would estimate is 40 or 50% of the knowledge I hope to have to make a good decision. But you got to make the decision anyway, so you go with your gut and you do the best you can. Other times I get probably 300% of the knowledge I need. I have to tell the staff to just stop. You know, I know what I want to say. I know what I'm going to decide. I don't need any more information or any more knowledge about that particular subject. And trying to manage that balance without killing your staff, but getting enough information to make a right decision at the right time is another way that we're trying to shape knowledge management within our organization. And with one last point, I know I'm probably going to get tossed off the stage here, but in leader development, we use a model, basically a three-legged stool of training, education, and experiences. And I tell you, with the tools we have today in our knowledge network, I think what we really have is a four-legged stool. We have the training that you give a soldier the education that you try to prepare them to be a leader with, their own individual experiences, and then the shared experiences that you get through a knowledge network. You know, mentorship, like that CW5 mentoring that young 11 Bravo, that mentorship went to probably 10, 15,000 different people in that one moment. So it's not, mentorship is usually thought about in one-to-one, in a one-to-one sort of environment. This is like 1 to thousands, you know, so we all garnered the value of that mentorship, which was incredible stuff. And I like to view it as really kind of a four-legged stool when you think about the power of knowledge networks and knowledge management applied and how we develop leaders.
Thanks, sir. Only a fool would throw his ball across off the stage. Now that we've got two questions out of the way.
Now I realize why you put me on this panel.
Now that we've got two easy questions out of the way, we've got the engines warmed up, let's get to the big animal and the elephant in the room. Next chart. Does knowledge management play a role in how organizations deal with a resource-constrained environment? We'll start off with Ms. Hubert.
He said we're supposed to be controversial. So, knowledge management's role, you know, we've had this big debate going on about the management of knowledge. And as I said in my first session, that knowledge management is about the core team that manages the processes, the approaches, the system, you know, builds a nice program that people can come and leverage and use when they need their knowledge to flow. So I think you get back to, in this question, the accountability for knowledge management. There is a clear accountability for people who are in the role of helping with those processes, leading out, communicating, working with IT to have systems in place. And there is an investment required for that, both in people and in any type of system that you're using. And the larger, more complex system you are, and you want it all connected and integrated, the more dollars you're probably going to have to invest. But there's also this other, there's the dark side of all this. The reason we like that when IT solutions or systems purport saying, oh, here is your knowledge management solution, it's because it takes the accountability off of where the knowledge sits, because we think it's just going to jump in some system or into some process and magically disperse or provide someone best practice. And so I think the accountability for knowledge gets back to the business leaders, the managers. They're the people who are leading those domains, the areas where knowledge needs to flow. And sometimes they need to flow locally, and sometimes they need to flow outside of that local environment in a global sense. And we often use this, we have constraints, because we put this as someone is responsible for making this all happen in terms of knowledge flow. Knowledge management, yes, someone's accountable for that. That's the lowest dollar amount you're going to spend. The people that are out in the field and in your business lines, your lines of effort, I think you called them earlier, are the ones that are accountable for helping this flow. And your business will always be resource constrained. We always will be. And I'm going to give you a great example in terms of what I mean by having good processes that help knowledge flow. And I'm going to use my friends at the Navy Carrier Team 1 as an example. They have a pristine, documented process around their proven practice replication. So we find something good that's working on the deck plate or in one of our areas of nuclear reactors, work control, we can quickly replicate that and move it around to who needs to know it. So that process is documented. They have a system that, I would say it's average. They hate it, and that's always the first thing we attack. But it's average, and it does work. And the process works. What's not happening in that system, and it's broken in some parts it works really well, but they had clear accountability in this documented process flow of how a practice should be identified, validated, and then shared and used in other parts of the organization on carrier when it's under maintenance. And it wasn't working. What they immediately did, instead of saying we should fix the process and look at the accountability where it lies on getting a practice a proven practice to flow. Let's just put a resource, a person in place to bridge that process, opposed to fixing the process and holding people accountable. And it's an example of how you can get to this stage where you're applying a lot of resources in the name of knowledge flow when it's not necessary because accountability is the issue.
Dr. Kirsch?
I guess all these questions are kind of easy ones. They're all yes. So obviously there is a connection. It's kind of silly to sit here and say there wasn't. I think one of the bigger issues, though, is really how that connection is made. I'm going to say something that might seem kind of controversial, but knowledge management has absolutely no value whatsoever. Pause for dramatic effect. Sorry, you don't watch kids' movies, so you have a 10-year-old daughter. But the point of it is that knowledge management is really nothing more than value adding. What we've got are inputs, processes, and outputs/outcomes out there. And what knowledge management is supposed to do is put the right knowledge in what I call a knowledge sack supporting that process. And if you put the right knowledge in that knowledge sack, then your output/outcomes improve, assuming that's the desired effect, of course. Maybe you want yours to go down, but assuming that you want them to go up, then we're looking at the value-added side of KM. And so what we're looking for then is really not so much the role that knowledge management plays in that, more the role of what knowledge plays in that, the right knowledge. So what we're talking about then is the right knowledge to make better decisions, to be able to deal with customer stakeholder needs and requirements a little bit better. It's sort of that difference between understanding needs versus wants. We try to deliver to wants, thinking that they're needs, we end up in an unhappy place at the end of the day. So having the right knowledge available to us then improves those processes that we've got, which then produce that economic gain. There are all the big studies out there where they talk about Gartner, KPMG, any of those folks. They talk about the benefits that we get from knowledge management, and always up at the top of the list is enhanced decision-making, economic improvements, better meeting stakeholder customer needs, things like that. So clearly the point then of knowledge management is to make sure that knowledge that is needed to provide that value added to achieve those benefits is where it is when we need it.
Mr. Moore?
Yeah, I guess this is sort of an easy answer, but how knowledge management is playing a role in our resource-constrained environment is a big thing for us, because the Army's going through some major cuts. I just had a town hall with our civilian workforce on Monday talking about the specific cuts that our organization had to take, and folks were notified yesterday of the ones that lost their jobs, and we're placing them so nobody's walking out the door, but these are tough times for both military and civilians inside the Army. And when I look at where we are in terms of resource constraints and then trying to apply new ways of doing business so we can get it, hopefully, the same output at lesser input, get back to what I mentioned earlier about industrial age processes enhanced right now by digital tools, but we haven't re-engineered the processes yet to take advantage of, or at least full advantage of the digital tools. And I'll take training developments as my example here. Training developments, those programs of instruction that I mentioned earlier, there's a huge process associated with how we build POIs and then how we build the lesson plans from those POIs. And it is truly an industrial age process. I mean, it's dictated on kind of a time constraint and trying to attach a time limit to relevance, which is really a tough assumption that I don't quite buy. And then supposedly on a 3-year cycle we update these POIs, and there's all kinds of steps you have to follow when you update a POI. And I tell you what, the first time I saw that, I went, really 3 years to update a POI in this environment that we're operating in? I mean, that's just nuts. And what I'd like to do is really have a continuous improvement type process enabled by things like knowledge management tools that allows us to do it a lot more efficiently, but frankly get orders of magnitude more effectiveness out of it. Because in the end, we're trying to deliver relevant learning as we develop these leaders. And it should be faster and it should be more relevant. And generally that'll mean, I hope, that'll be a bit cheaper as well. So with that.
Dr. Stankowski?
Let me try to put my Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy here. I've always wanted to do syllogism and the like. If you are a knowledge-based organization, And knowledge is a strategic asset. In fact, I would have preferred to call knowledge management strategic resource management because it is the dominant asset in the knowledge-based organization. You may not be, but if you are, okay, follow me. Then that's your number one asset or resource you've got to manage. Manage has 4 functions: plan, organize, allocate, and control. So as a chief executive and general at SAS, head of a university, you have to manage your chief asset or resource, which is, I think, knowledge. At least I showed you, and these are not my numbers, $12 trillion of our 14 trillion come from knowledge. It's an infinite resource, yet it's constrained. We often think we find it in the organizations, which is only minimum. We get more knowledge from our competitors, our customers, our allies. The biggest flaw in KM is we only look internally. Knowledge is a freebie. Well, information and data is a freebie. What you do with it and convert it, because there's too much information. So if knowledge is and I look at knowledge in 3 ways. I put them in 3 buckets: critical, important, and nice to have. Everyone is chasing everything, but we never separate them. Remember the operations order, the commander's critical intelligence requirements? You didn't say nice to have, or is it critical? So if I'm building a 787, I need to know what my critical knowledge assets are, not only amongst Boeing, but amongst my 1,000 partners worldwide. So knowledge management to me is nothing more than strategic asset management. It's not a project, it's not an initiative, it's not a sideshow, it's not something I have to justify, it is the essence in a knowledge-based company. So you're always going to have constrained resources as a leader. Find me an executive that has unlimited resources and I'll show you a myth. I mean, I was an executive myself and I ran operations. So knowledge, if that's your critical resource, it is constrained, but how you manage it. And maybe I need to give you my definition of knowledge management. It's very simple. It has nothing to do with sharing, because I don't like sharing. I can share with you all you want, but you walk away and you go back to your dinner and you have a nice day. It's leveraging. If you can't get 1 + 1 is equal to 5 or 20, if you're sharing, that doesn't excite me. I get return on assets, return on resources. I'm leveraging them smartly. Remember IBM's do things smartly? Leveraging relevant. Relevant is what? We don't need metrics. You look at your objectives at every level. That's your measurement thing. Am I producing the 787? Am I producing a tire in 2 minutes? Knowledge has many shades and characters. Leveraging relevant knowledge assets. That's my definition. No more, no less. So that question is kind of different for me, but knowledge management is the only game in town in a knowledge-based economy. And so I don't know what we're talking about here. See what I'm saying? Maybe not.
All right, let's move on to the next question. This is asking the panel, from their experience and perspective, what are some challenges and key factors to ensuring organizations harvest the full value of what they of their investment knowledge? We'll start off with Dr. Kirsch.
Okay, the questions get tougher, not just yes or no's. Yeah, thank you. To me, I think one of the bigger problems that we've had, and I've certainly seen this with the DoD folks I've worked with, and I've been working with you guys for 15 years now, is that in a lot of cases we still really lack a good understanding at the big giant head level as to what knowledge management is. And so whatever the big giant head has in an interpretation of what knowledge management is, that's what gets implemented, that's what gets measured, that's what gets reported. I think one of the big challenges that we have is we've got to have seniors held accountable for implementing knowledge management, for really doing this value-added stuff. And if we do that, then we'd be kind of moving back a little bit more on looking at the IT, the enablers, and not pushing that front end. But that's probably one of the biggest issues that we've got. We've actually got a requirement inside of OPM, I don't know if government folks know this or not, but all 13s and above are actually required by OPM to be evaluated on knowledge management. How many government folks do we have in the room here, 13s and above? Show of hands. Okay, look around, see the hands. Now, how many of you get evaluated on knowledge management? See the problem? And we actually have a couple of hands in here. That's amazing. I had the deputy director of OPM in a workshop of mine 2 weeks ago. We were talking about this exact issue. And that's one of the big issues that the federal government in general has a bit of a hard spot right now, is that, again, if the big giant head sees KM as the SharePoint implementation, whatever, it's just a tool. But then that's what everybody is measuring inside the organization. So we talk about challenges and key factors. If the key factor is not doing the right thing, I don't know what it is. So what we end up doing is we do lots of things that we think are key things, but I'm not really sure they're actually accomplishing anything. Probably the other factor, just to kind of squeeze in my time here, is figure out where in the world KM is going to be in the organization. And we've all been down this dirty road a few times before. It started out with one code, gone to another, and most of the time it ends up in the SIG shop. And sort of like Maslow, we're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but another thing that he said is quite famous was, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, the problem wants to be a nail. So we, for years and years, looked at every KM issue as an IT kind of problem to solve. And so I think being able to get that to some place where you have strategic decision makers, and as Mike is suggesting, I think it's a very good point about looking at it as strategic asset management. It has to be managed from that direction, I think. And that's probably one of our bigger issues, I think, keeping us from getting that value out of knowledge management today.
Mr. Moore.
Yeah, that last point about where in the organization to put it is one that I had to wrestle with from the start. And you know, do you put it in a 3 shop? Do you put it in your G6 shop? We ended up just leaving it as a separate entity, and frankly made it a direct report to me to sort of create the senior leader emphasis on the program, because the way, at least the way we were seeing it, it needs to proliferate across the organization, right down to the action officer level, day to day, to get the most value out of it. Because frankly, most of our knowledge lies at that level, and you're trying to get that knowledge and leverage it, as Dr. Stokowski just talked about. But and then of course, trying to resource it at the appropriate level is another challenge. When we first stood Pat up, it was painful, but we dug out 8 professional staff years, and that's how I resourced this capability for our organization. We really didn't know if 8 was right or not, and it turned out to not be right. We eventually added, I don't know, 6 or so additional contract support years from year to year to manage that sustainment knowledge network I was talking about, and we were maintaining a standard of no question goes unanswered inside 24 hours. So they had 24 hours to get an answer, and generally it happens within a few minutes, but sometimes it doesn't. And part of what this team does is track those and make sure answers get pushed back out to any questions that pop out. So I was very happy to hear from Cindy Hubert this morning that you can do it with 4, and I'll be talking to Pat after the show today.
Thanks, Cindy.
But that again is another challenge, and frankly, just trying to sell KM at the senior leader levels. We had, when General Dempsey took over TRADOC 2 years ago, before he went on to bigger and greater things, we had our first knowledge management forum with him, and he was like, what the heck is this thing? You know, I mean, he was really struggling to understand it because he knew it was powerful, but he didn't know why. He had that gut feeling, and he dragged in all of TRADOC senior leaders to talk about it. And frankly, Pat was able to help him understand it because we had very real examples of how we were using it, at least within the sustainment community. And he really took it on, and it became a true enabler across the training and doctrine command as we tried to implement some of the changes he wanted in learning and how we were evolving as a teacher of soldiers. But getting that challenge, because you know he walks out the door, get a new commander, we start all over trying to help him justify why he needs a certain capability. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just getting the processes modernized to match the tools that are available to execute. You know, I think that's probably enough on that. Thanks.
Dr. Stankowski?
Again, if you go back to my definition or my construct, if knowledge is your strategic asset, as I think we kind of know it is intuitively, because it happens, then obviously it belongs, and the only way you're going to get it working is if the leadership recognizes it. It's like going to Goodyear and say, justify rubber to make a tire. Justify knowledge for my organization. I mean, it's ludicrous. You can't produce the output without the knowledge. The challenge is, what knowledge? We don't know how to do requirements-based knowledge. I'm a systems engineer. What critical knowledge do we need? Well, if I'm an airplane designer, you sit down and you say, well, what do you need to design an airplane? I'm a tank driver. What do I need to drive a tank? What knowledge, information, and data critical do I need to do it? If you don't have a list or inventory, then guess what? You don't know what the hell you're doing. And that's what's happening today. Clearly, if knowledge is a strategic asset, which I advocate, and I think it is, statistically and everything, then it belongs at the chief executive, and we normally give that to the operations guy, the president, which is the chief operations officer. Just like cash is very important to an organization, and cash flow, so the chief executive worries about it, but he gives it to his chief financial officer. And someone talked about the ratio of KM to this. What's the ratio of financial people in an organization to the organization? It's the same thing. They're assets. And we pay a lot of money for those assets. We don't know what they are yet. We don't know the value of them because we're not in a knowledge-based economy. We don't have international accounting standards for these assets. I'm on a charter group out of Austria for 5 years. We're just trying to come up with international accounting standards. But we don't have them. We don't know the value of them. So what are the challenges? Well, I think it starts from the beginning, recognizing that it's a strategic asset. If every commander walks in the door and has a list of his knowledge assets, he has a list of his people. He knows human capital pretty well. He knows that, yeah, I want Cindy on my team. Yeah, but he doesn't know his organizational capital. He kind of gets into that, but he doesn't even have any clue of his relationship capital. I think that's the biggest challenge. The executives don't know what they're doing in a knowledge-based organization. So we're always going to have the issue of these conferences and these questions, because none of you have agreed on a definition or a framework and agreed that we're in a knowledge-based army. If you do, you wouldn't be here. But you're here.
Ms. Hewart?
So the biggest enduring barriers for CAM that we've seen are twofold. One is getting senior leadership's attention and funding. And the second one is getting people to participate and advocate the knowledge management approaches that can be used. And Pat, I'll have to help you with the funding and stuff and resources later. But I'm going to deal with the second one because I think it's probably more relevant to this group. In our session earlier, there were several people who said knowledge is power. So my interpretation of that is you still are dealing with the fact that people hoard knowledge. Is that pretty correct from our audience sitting here? So here's a challenge for you. Think about this. What we have found to be is quite contradictory to that. People are really not hoarding their knowledge. What they hoard is actually a more precious commodity, and that is their time. And people don't want to spend time doing something or having to come out of their workflow to go participate in something that is in the name of knowledge management or collaboration, because it takes them out of the flow and it actually takes them more time. And so you may think that they're hoarding what they know, but it's just because they just don't have the time in the workflow. So again, work in the flow. Find the problems, find the issues that people are dealing with. Knowledge is not a thing, it's a flow, as APQC views it. And figure out how to help those people let their knowledge flow so that they can. If you're dealing with, in the question earlier, we were saying where can knowledge management help in a constrained environment. So define the value that you bring in terms of the business. If you're dealing in that constrained environment, one of your challenges is probably to get people's competencies up more quickly. So time to competency becomes a very important thing. So look at that through your knowledge lens and say, how do we help people do that? How do we actually, understand, how do we get people connected to experts? And as I shared earlier in our earlier session, Flora and ConocoPhillips, if you want to get the best practices as someone junior coming in reservoir engineering or drilling or construction, you go to the community to get access to that knowledge, and it builds that, it lessens the time to competency, is what we're seeing through their measures.
Thank you. Move on to number 5, please. So given what we've said, this is kind of a summation.